Hey guys, it's Mr. Brown. I'm going to try to talk you through the Chapter 19 PowerPoint. I don't know how well this is going to work. I don't have the program, Camtasia, to do this the way it needs to be done, and I don't have $300 to sink into it right now. So we'll just see if this works even a little bit, and you guys can give me feedback. If you don't feel like it helped, we can just wing it as we've been doing thus far. All right. I don't even know if this thing's still recording or not, but here we go. If you look at the first slide of Chapter 19, it starts with Chapter 19 becoming an industrial giant, 1870-1900. The next slide talks about Andrew Carnegie, 1835 to 1919. And as it says, Carnegie was he's the father of the American steel industry. Carnegie starts off as the owner-operator of the Keystone Bridge Company, and he was basically building iron bridges for the railroad companies. The problem with iron is that you think of iron as being really strong, but iron has got some problems. It rusts. It does not bend. It'll crack and fracture before it bends. Steel would be preferable, but in this time period, 1884, steel is hard to make. It's very hard to make, and it's expensive as all get out. All right. Clicking the slide, you see a picture of two men, William Kelly and Henry Bessemer. These two men, operating independently, one in America, one in Scotland, basically came up with the exact same formula for developing cheap, efficient steel. This might seem weird, but actually there are parallels. A lot of times we've seen technology evolving at the same time because different people are after the same process. They do call it the Bessemer process, however. Mr. Kelly gets forgotten. Basically, if you look at the little graph on the Bessemer process slide, it shows the method of creating steel. It's actually something fairly simple. As you are smelting steel, you blow cold air into the furnace. This causes carbon, which is what causes the problems in steel and makes it difficult to produce and basically creates flaws in it, to burn off. All right, it burns off as carbon monoxide. This simple little thing of blowing cold air into the slag and the steel basically made it where you could produce 5 tons of steel in 15 minutes as opposed to 12 hours. And suddenly steel becomes cheap, inexpensive, and it explodes. Carnegie gets in on the ground floor of this and founds the Carnegie Steel Company. He basically founds his company in Pittsburgh, PA, and within probably just about 10 years, maybe 20, over 90% of the steel made in the United States will be produced by Andrew Carnegie. This will basically make steel plentiful and cheap, and it becomes used in everything. Cheap steel allows for us to begin building structures such as skyscrapers and structures like the Brooklyn Bridge, which becomes, at its time period, the longest steel suspension bridge in the world at its time. Steel becomes common for everyday use, like pots and pans. And of course, steel becomes the primary beating, thumping heart of the rail industry as they expand out. All right. Carnegie's net worth when he died was $480 million. Now, if you adjust that for inflation, that means in modern money he was worth $310 billion, billion with a B. This makes him the fourth richest human being in human history. All right. And he gave 75% of it back to charity. Carnegie, sometimes he's called a robber baron because, admittedly, his steel factories depended on cheap labor. Carnegie was one of the better, quote-unquote, robber barons because he did believe in a fair wage for a fair day's work. And he did give, millions of dollars back to charity. The little quote on one of the slides says, "Wealth is not to feed our egos, but to feed the hungry and help people help themselves." In his main contribution would be the Carnegie Public Libraries, which he built in America, England, and Scotland. And in the little chart on one of the slides, you'll see the states where he built Carnegie Libraries. Particularly, he built them in California, New York, Illinois, Indiana. There's a few in North Carolina. He also basically gave heavily to colleges and universities, including helping to found the Tuskegee Institute. All right. Next, we talk about John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. This is the beginnings of the petroleum industry. The petroleum industry has its birth in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859. The first oil derrick was built by a former military engineer named Edwin Drake in 1859. He starts off, with backers. When they begin to pull out on him, he pours his own money into it and builds the first oil derrick. This is going to start the oil industry when he strikes oil. At first, oil is processed into kerosene and gasoline. And these are used primarily for heating more than anything else. But of course, later, when the automobiles and the internal combustion engine becomes widely used, it'll become fuel for cars and trucks. At one point, there were more millionaires per square mile in Titusville than there were anywhere else in the country, because Titusville was the original oil capital of America, if not the entire world. Now later, of course, it'll move out to the west, Texas, California, places like that. But it has its beginnings in Titusville, Pennsylvania. All right. Rockefeller gets in on the oil refining business. He thinks it's too risky to actually hunt for oil, but the oil has to be refined to put it into some sort of usable form. So in 1870, he founds Standard Oil. Within just 20 years, he'll control 90% of the American oil business. All right, and Rockefeller is something of a robber baron, in my opinion. He basically is, no doubts whatsoever, the richest man in American history. If you look at his modern net worth, he's worth $340 billion. Now, to put that in perspective, Bill Gates, Microsoft, is only worth $87 billion. All right. Rockefeller, unless I'm mistaken, is the second richest human being in history. The first richest was an African king named Mansa Musa, who basically was worth about $500 billion. All right. Now, all these guys all these different guys like Rockefeller and Carnegie, and a few other guys like Cornelius Vanderbilt and J.P. Morgan, like I said, they're referred to rather negatively as robber barons by people who do not like their style of business. They begin forming what becomes known as corporations. And these are basically companies that are very large organizations made up of many smaller companies. And one of the slides gives you a picture of several modern corporations: Coca-Cola, Kraft, Nestle, Procter & Gamble, PepsiCo, General Mills, Kellogg's, Mars, and Johnson & Johnson. And if you look closely at that picture, they own many other companies underneath them. Pepsi, for instance, owns Pizza Hut, KFC, Taco Bell. They own, the Quaker Cereal Company. Just many surprising things. Kraft, which you think of as cheese, basically owns another several dozen different companies that churn out various products, and it's just really interesting. All right. A lot of people did not like these massive corporations, and they began calling them monopolies. Monopolies are basically large companies that kind of dominate their particular markets. They become the sole, or if not the sole, supplier of a particular good, then they supply more of it than anybody else ever could. Because they control so much of this particular product, They can basically ask whatever they want for their product, and if you want that product, you have to pay it. One of the slides, the Monopoly slide, has two cartoons at the bottom. One depicting Standard Oil as sort of a giant octopus creature that's reaching around the Capitol building and that's reaching for the White House. And it's basically got a bunch of senators and congressmen wrapped up in its coils. Some people basically think that this is okay, that they call it social Darwinism, and basically it's a form of survival of the fittest. These strong, powerful companies basically fight and win and survive. All depends on how favorable you are of capitalism. All right. Now, these corporations operated by two systems of organization called vertical integration and horizontal integration. Carnegie used vertical integration. And vertical integration basically means you control every aspect of your particular product from where it was produced. And there's on one of the slides, it basically refers to meat packing, which means you control every aspect of it, from the cattle to the slaughterhouse, to the rail cars that transport the meat, to the warehouses where it is stored, to the meat packing plants where it is processed, to the delivery vehicles that carry it to the consumer. You basically control every step of the process from A to Z. All the money, basically all the businesses are owned by you. All right. Now, horizontal integration, which is what Rockefeller and Standard Oil used, basically is where a large corporation will buy up small independent companies that could be potential competitors. You eliminate the competition by simply buying them and absorbing them into your larger business. Some people basically are okay with vertical integration. A lot of people consider horizontal integration to be predatory. You're basically putting the competition out of business by buying the competition. All right. Now, there's a particular cartoon included in the PowerPoint called The Bosses of the Senate. And it has basically these large humanoid money bags. And they have words on them like Standard Oil Trust, Copper Trust, Steel Beam Trust, coal. These are the large, powerful corporations that basically had so much power and so much influence, they could more or less boss the government around, and the government couldn't really say no to them. Plus, they were pretty much, in some cases, bribing the senators to get them to do what they want. Today, on paper, at least this is illegal. In reality, we call it lobbying. All right, and I'll let you look up that word for yourselves. But it basically amounts to the same thing. Large, powerful corporations exert influence on the government to get them to do things that they want. All right. If you look up in the far right-hand corner of the cartoon, you'll see a small door that basically says "People's Considerations" or something of that effect. And it's not only closed, it's locked shut. So basically, whoever wrote the cartoon, I believe it's a man named Kepler, a very famous cartoonist, he's basically saying these fat cats, these corporate guys, were basically not concerned with the welfare of the average American. All right. The third major industry we're going to talk about is meat processing, which basically began in Chicago, which came to be known as the hog butcher of the world. If you look at the slide that deals with this, you'll basically see a large picture, black and white, on the top. And what you have there is really, honestly, a city-sized meat packing plant. You see acre upon acre of holding pens for animals. All right. And for a while there, Chicago was the meat processing capital of the world, and it still kind of is today. All right. Several different people are discussed as innovators in the meat packing industry. You got guys like Philip Armour, who started off as a butcher, just a simple butcher, but basically built his product into the Armour Meat Packing Company, which is still around today. If you look at the slide, you'll see Armour Deli Meat, you'll see Armour Vienna Sausages, Armour Treat Meat, Armour Corned Beef Hash, which you can right now you may not be able to go to the grocery store and find it, but give it a few days, it'll be back. You have a guy named Nelson Morris, who basically did a very similar thing. He basically built the Nelson Morris and Company Fairbanks Canning Company, again, processing meat, canning it, distributing it out to the people. Gustav Swift is an innovator because he basically built the first refrigerated rail car, which basically meant that once you had the meat processed, you could ship it farther, and the meat would not spoil. Prior to this, basically, the meat would be alive, which is to say it would be animals kept alive, and they'd be shipped to the slaughterhouses so they could be slaughtered in the individual cities and distributed throughout the cities locally before they could spoil. All right. The fourth major issue we're going to talk about is rail. Chapter 18 already discussed rail quite a bit with the Transatlantic Railroad. Now we're going to talk about the guys who more or less built the two major railroads of America, railroad networks, I guess we should say. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who in 1862 began with two small railroads in New York, the Harlem and New York Railroad Companies, and over a period of years built them into a network that spans from the East Coast, Boston at its furthest point, all the way out to Illinois, all right, and as far down south as Virginia and Kentucky, as far north as Montreal and Ottawa in Canada, all right. Vanderbilt is another one who basically seems to be a little bit less predatory. He gives a lot of money back to the communities. Not so much James J. Hill, who built the Great Northern Railroad, which stretches basically from Wisconsin all the way over to Oregon and Washington along the Canadian border. This guy was a hard-driving corporate businessman. The quote kind of tells you just about everything you need to know about the guy. Give me snuff, whiskey, Swedes, and I will build a railroad to hell. All right? Now, this whole period sees a explosion of innovation and technological advancement, an age of invention. Can't talk. All right? Thomas Edison in this period basically comes to fame. Now, Edison, a lot of people have a very negative opinion of Edison. They say that he basically stole a lot of the 1,093 patents that he invented, that somebody else actually invented them, and he took credit for them. There is arguably some truth to that. Edison wasn't a dummy. He was a very intelligent innovator himself, but he also was an incredibly good organizer. And his dream factory in Menlo Park was basically a giant research firm. And if you worked for him, your invention belonged to him. We basically can thank the Dream Factory, Edison, directly, indirectly, for the phonograph, which is to say the record player, the incandescent light bulb, thank God for electric lights, and even motion picture cameras. All right. Your book doesn't make much mention of him, but I felt like George Washington Carver had to be mentioned during this time period. He's most famous for just thinking of 300 different uses for peanuts. But also many uses for sweet potatoes, soybeans, pecans, black-eyed peas. Now, you're saying, why does that matter? By the way, Carver did not invent peanut butter. It's important because Carver probably, in doing this, single-handedly saved the southern agricultural economy. There was a cotton blight, a disease that was killing the cotton plants. And if you paid any attention at all to history, you know that cotton was king in the South. Even before and after the war. These innovations made by Carver give the South alternative crops, peanuts, soybeans, sweet potatoes, that they can grow and make a profit off of when the cotton basically could not be produced. All right? So that's why I've included Carver. Without Carver, there's a whole lot we wouldn't have. All right? You have Lewis Waterman inventing the modern pen, a little thing that you wouldn't think twice about, but hey, this is when it came about. You had George Eastman inventing the Kodak camera. All right. You had Elisha Otis perfecting the elevator in 1852. Otis's innovation was inventing a brick that would actually keep the thing from falling just in case the cable broke. Elevators became absolutely essential as buildings got taller and taller thanks to steel. Next time you go into an elevator, look around. You will probably see Otis's name somewhere. All right. And then you have Ottmar Mergenthaler, who in 1879 invented the typewriter. All right. Things we don't even think twice about. Things we take for granted. They all came about in this time period. And then you got Henry Ford. Ford is, of course, given credit for eventually inventing the automobile. We'll get to that later. He's actually more accurately given credit for inventing the assembly line. But he did do early experiments with gasoline-powered vehicles. In the slide with his picture on it, you see a little perambulator, as they were called. It's got a little 2-horsepower motor on it, which you can see off there to the side. You could run faster than it could go. But this was how he basically began his work. And, of course, from Henry Ford will come the American auto industry. And, as I mentioned, large-scale production thanks to the assembly line. All right, guys, I hope that helps. As always, do your questions. Please send me the questions because I'm not seeing anything from you guys in terms of history. And if you're not going to do the work, there's no point in our doing this. If you don't do the work, you will be delayed in graduation. Your call. If you need me, call, text, email. I'm right here. Have a good night.